So I posted a video the other day of me building a workbench, and I got a text from my mother soon after asking if I could build her a thread shelf for her sewing room. Now look, I'm not an experienced enough woodworker at this point to be taking commission work, but I thought what mom wants, mom gets. I'm really glad she asked though. This was a fun project. I challenged myself. I didn't want to use mechanical fasteners of any kind to hold this thing together. I wanted it to look nice hanging in her house. So I opted to use rabbets and dados instead to hold it together. But it was a little bit of a challenge. I don't have a table saw that can hold the dado stack to cut those easier, so I used a router instead. Had to come up with a jig to cut those dados in the sides of the thread shelf. Look, I'm very confident that anybody could build this with a few simple tools, and the design is basic enough that it could easily be modified in dimensions to hold really anything that you wanted. So as always, I welcome comments, feedback. Let me know what you would do differently, how you would build this thing better than how I did it. But I appreciate you watching, and get out there and build something. So I put together a mock-up via SketchUp, that's a mouthful, and use that to plan out all the measurements and cuts that I'd have to make and just make sure everything in my head was actually going to translate to the real world. Again, this is the first time I've done rabbets and dados on a project, so this extra step certainly helped me. If you would like these plans, I will find a way to link them for free in the video description. Got a bunch of this eastern red cedar left over from a fence that I built last year around our house. I wish you guys could smell how good this pile of wood smells in my shop. And I just love the natural grain that this wood has. Once you sand it and finish it, it really comes out, and it's pretty easy to work with. It's very forgiving. So shout out to Grant Cedar Mill, about an hour outside of Nashville, Tennessee, for supplying the wood for this build. The lumber came from the mill in true 1x6 dimensions, which was perfect for my fence project, but definitely way overkill for this shelf that I wanted to make. So I made a post on my local neighborhood Facebook group and found a fellow woodworker who was able to help me resaw this down with his bandsaw, and also ran it through his planer. But this was a crash course for me in planer snipe. As you can see, it was pretty severe on some of these boards, so I had to be pretty mindful of that when chopping it down on the miter saw. But shout out to Christopher in Nashville for helping me out. Really appreciate it. The actual shelf is going to be just under half the width of these 6-inch boards, but rather than rip them to width first on the table saw, I opted to cut them to length on the chop saw first, just to make sure all my pieces are exactly the same, then take them over to the table saw and rip them from there. My table saw is a vintage Craftsman, actually originally purchased by my great-grandfather, somewhere around 1948, 1950 probably. And it's been passed down through my family and used on a lot of different houses over the years. So I love the history behind this thing and the fact that I'm able to continue using it. But it's not without its quirks. I check it for square every time like this and just make sure it's set up to cut as accurately as possible. It also has 0 safety features, no riving knife, no blade guard, and I honestly find it pretty intimidating still to use. And I'm about to find out the hard way about taking into account the width or kerf of the saw blade when setting up your table to make your rip cuts. I feel like I'm not the only one though. We've all been there, right? And now the correct way to measure. Sometimes you just gotta learn the hard way. Now I hesitated to even include this clip in the final video because I don't want to set a bad example for anyone on using a table saw, but I can tell just from watching the footage how nervous I was about making this cut. I'm stepping way off to the side because I'm nervous about kickback, my hands, I don't know exactly where to put them, and my push stick is not robust enough to make this cut accurately or safely. So this was a great learning experience, and I made some changes right after completing this project. I purchased a gripper tool from MicroJig. I purchased and completed a table saw safety course from Stumpy Nubs, which I can't recommend enough. And I also made sure my first aid kit at my shop was properly outfitted. And I just wanted to say, listen to that little voice in your head. If you're ever nervous about using a tool, there's almost always an alternative way to accomplish the same thing. And I'm learning that about woodworking, so I just wanted to throw that out there for anybody else that's getting started with the hobby. So using the measurements for my plans, I marked out the locations for the rabbet joints along the top and bottom of the shelf, as well as the dados in the middle that will hold the actual shelves themselves. Now for actually removing the rabbets and dados, as I mentioned at the top of this video, my table saw won't accept a dado stack, and I also haven't got around to making a crosscut sled yet for the saw. So instead I opted to make this dado jig, a super simple project that I'll post a video for here soon. But this lets you use the actual shelf piece that you want to cut the dado for the measurement, ensuring that it's a perfect fit, and then you use a router with a guide bushing and a spiral upcut bit to follow along that jig like you see here and remove the dado. And because you use the actual shelf piece to measure the width of this dado, it's going to be a perfect fit, as long as your jig doesn't move side to side when you're pushing that router through. Don't ask me how I know that. And by sandwiching both sides of the shelves here together and cutting the dados for both simultaneously, you get a symmetrical cut on both sides. And as you can see, the shelf fits pretty snugly, and once this thing is glued up and all the shelves are installed, it's going to be very strong. And the process is exactly the same for cutting the rabbet joints on the ends of the shelves themselves. And I use that same jig. Here you can get a better view of what's going on there. So that guide bushing is just following along the edge of the dado jig, ensuring a straight cut. And now for another beginner woodworking moment. Whoops! And I gotta say, I was pretty happy with how the rabbet joints came together. Always room for improvement, but for the first time, not bad. Did a quick dry assembly before a glue up just to make sure everything was going to fit as hoped, and had a little inspection courtesy of my shop assistant Luther. How's that for a tight fit, huh? Yeah, I'll have to sand that one out a bit. Clearly it's too wide. What do you think?
Nice.
I was able to get that shelf to fit after giving it a once over with the sander, but while I was at it I also sanded everything on the inside of the shelf, because once it's glued up it's going to be pretty hard to get, the orbital sander in there. So the cedar came pretty rough from the mill, rougher than I wanted as a piece of furniture in my parents' house, so I had a lot of sanding in my future. Wiped everything down with mineral spirits to get the fine sawdust off of there, and then it was time to move on to the glue up. And despite sort of walking through the glue up steps in my head and laying everything out here in the order that I wanted to apply the glue, it still ended up being a pretty frantic glue up, and I realized partway through that the way I had my clamps laid out here wasn't going to be very conducive to getting everything together, so you'll see me sort of readjust here, but we got it together. Some Booker T green onions came on the shop radio here right at the perfect time. I'm probably going to get hit with a copyright notice on YouTube for that. And then quickly checked for square here before inserting the shelves. And I'm glad I did, because this thing was really not in square at all. And I discovered why pretty soon after. Tried inserting the first shelf here, but the frame of the shelf was not wide enough to accept it. And I loosened the clamp thinking it was clamped down too hard, but then realized maybe I put this together wrong somehow. So I grabbed my plans to confirm, and sure enough, discovered that I put the rabbet joints together wrong on the bottom section there. Thankfully the glue wasn't totally dry yet, and I was able to correct the mistake, but then I had glue kind of all over the project on that first shelf, so definitely not the most graceful of glue ups, but like I said, I'm glad I caught that before the glue totally dried on the outside frame. It's funny, making this video is sort of like reviewing game film. I'm watching this wondering why the hell I used so much glue on these shelves. Totally not necessary. And after fixing the rabbet joints on the outside frame, what do you know? The thing was in square. I threw this last clamp on and things just literally snapped together. awesome. I was pretty happy with how this is all coming together, but now I understand why every YouTube woodworker wears earbuds to listen to music while they're recording. "24 hours later." Pulled this thing out of the clamps. Time for sanding. Hours and hours of sanding. So much sanding. This video is probably already too long for what it is, but you can see the rough cut that I was dealing with there. And I decided here after hours and hours of sanding that a jointer and planer are definitely on my list of tools to acquire at some point. The old Black & Decker orbital sander got it done. Final step here, obviously applying some finish. I knew I wanted to preserve the natural look of the cedar as much as possible. It's just such gorgeous wood on its own. And I also was on a bit of a time crunch. Didn't want to use polyurethane because I didn't want to wait for it to dry. I also just haven't had good luck applying poly in the past. So I wanted to try something different. Did a lot of research on the topic. I picked up this book called Understanding Wood Finishing by Bob Flexner, which I can't recommend enough. And I ended up settling on shellac for the finish here. I thinned it out with a 2-to-1 ratio of denatured alcohol, and that allowed me to put it on in a pretty quick fashion. It dried super quick and didn't have any air bubbles because it was thinned out. I sanded it in between coats with 220 sandpaper and put on about 3 coats in total, and I gotta say I was really happy with the way this turned out. It looks totally natural, didn't really color the wood any. It just really brings out the natural grain like you can see here. So really recommend working with shellac, and it doesn't produce any harmful vapors, so it was nice not to have to wear the respirator while putting this on. That's going to be it for this build video. If you've made it this far, congrats. I know this is not the most complicated of projects, but I certainly learned a lot, and I had a lot of fun throughout the process. And in my opinion, that's what it's all about, right? And the client's happy. My mom is using this in her sewing room as we speak, and she seems to dig it. It looks good hanging on the wall, so thanks for watching, everybody. Get out there and build something.